The thud of the aluminum bat echoed across the quiet suburban street as it connected with the old ball, sending it sailing over the fence. 12-year-old Max whooped with joy, his eyes alight with triumph. But his elation quickly turned to dread as a piercing shriek shattered the afternoon calm. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed HOA enforcer, came storming out of her immaculate lawn, her face contorted with rage. "You hooligans are destroying my property." Max froze, clutching the bat as Karen advanced, her fingers curled into claws. I'm sorry, ma'am," he stammered, backpedaling hastily. "It was an accident. An accident." Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "You think you can just go around smashing things and pretend it's an accident?" She lunged forward, her hand swinging back to strike the terrified boy. The crack of knuckles against flesh resounded through the air as a figure stepped between them, catching Karen's wrist in a vice-like grip. Max's mother, Sarah, glared at the older woman, her jaw set in a hard line. "I think you need to calm down," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "It was a mistake, and my son has already apologized." Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Your son is a menace, and you're just as bad for letting him run wild." She yanked her hand free, her chest heaving with fury. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." With that, she stormed back to her immaculate lawn, muttering under her breath. Max looked up at his mother, his eyes wide with fear and gratitude. "Mom, I'm so sorry." Sarah held up a hand, silencing him. "It's all right, honey. Let's just go inside and get you cleaned up." She cast a wary glance at Karen's retreating figure, her brow furrowed with concern. As they made their way to the front door, Max couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The next morning, Max awoke to the sound of raised voices coming from the kitchen. Creeping downstairs, he peered around the corner to see his mother engaged in a heated argument with Karen. "This is completely unacceptable, Sarah." Karen's face was flushed with anger. "Your son's reckless behavior has caused thousands of dollars in damage to my property. I demand compensation, and I want it now." Sarah's expression was one of weary exasperation. "Karen, we've already apologized and offered to pay for the repairs. What more do you want from us?" "What I want is for you to keep that delinquent under control." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "If I have to come over here one more time because of your son's antics, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA. And trust me, you don't want to see what happens then." Max felt his stomach twist with dread. He knew his mother had been working extra shifts to make ends meet, and the thought of having to pay for the damages was already causing her stress. The last thing they needed was to be at odds with the neighborhood's self-appointed tyrant. Sarah's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Max saw the exhaustion in her eyes. "Fine, Karen. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." She turned and caught sight of Max peering around the corner, her expression softening. "Max, honey, can you come in here, please?" Reluctantly, Max stepped into the kitchen, feeling the weight of Karen's disapproving gaze upon him. "I'm sorry, Mom," he murmured, staring at the floor. Sarah reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "I know, sweetie, but we're going to have to be extra careful from now on, okay? No more playing ball in the yard until we can figure something out." Max nodded, his heart sinking. He knew his mother was doing her best to keep the peace, but the thought of being confined to the house all summer filled him with dread. As Karen swept out of the kitchen, her nose in the air, Max couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult battle. Over the next few weeks, the tension between the two households continued to escalate. Whenever Max so much as stepped outside, Karen would materialize, berating him and threatening to report his every move to the HOA. Sarah tried to reason with her, but the older woman refused to listen, her vendetta against the boy and his reckless behavior seemingly unshakable. One particularly sweltering afternoon, Max was sitting on the front porch, listlessly scrolling through his phone when he heard the familiar sound of Karen's car pulling into the driveway. Bracing himself, he glanced up, only to see the woman storming towards him, her face twisted with fury. "You!" she spat, her finger jabbing accusingly in his direction. "I just caught your little friends trampling all over my flower beds. This is the last straw, young man." Max opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Karen's hand lashed out, striking him across the face. The force of the blow sent him reeling, his phone clattering to the ground as he stared at her in stunned disbelief. "Now you listen to me, you little hooligan," Karen hissed, her eyes narrowed to slits. "If I so much as see you or your friends setting foot on my property again, I'll make sure you're expelled from school and your mother loses her job. Do you understand?" Max nodded mutely, his cheek stinging from the slap. As Karen turned on her heel and stalked back to her car, he felt a surge of anger and humiliation wash over him. How dare this woman treat him like this, in his own home? Gritting his teeth, Max clenched his fists, trying to ignore the tears of frustration that threatened to spill down his cheeks. He knew he couldn't retaliate, not with Karen's threats hanging over their heads. But the idea of just rolling over and accepting her abuse was more than he could bear. Glancing down at his phone, Max's eyes widened as an idea began to take shape. Perhaps it was time to fight fire with fire, and he knew exactly where to start. Over the next few days, Max put his plan into action, meticulously gathering evidence and documenting every interaction with Karen. He recorded their confrontations, cataloged the damage to his mother's property, and even managed to obtain a copy of the HOA's bylaws. Armed with this information, he approached his mother, his eyes shining with determination. "Mom, I think I know how we can get Karen off our backs for good," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Sarah eyed him warily. "Max, I don't want you to do anything reckless. We've been trying to keep the peace, and—" "No, listen," Max interrupted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Karen's been violating the HOA rules left and right. She's destroying our property, physically assaulting me, and threatening us, all of which is against the bylaws. If we take this to the HOA board, they'll have to do something about it." Sarah's brow furrowed as she considered her son's words. "Are you sure about this, honey? I don't want you to get your hopes up, and I'm worried about retaliation from Karen." "I'm sure, Mom," Max replied, his voice firm. "We have to at least try. I'm tired of living in fear and letting her push us around." Sensing her son's determination, Sarah let out a resigned sigh. "All right, Max, let's do it. But promise me you'll be careful, okay?" Max nodded, his lips curving into a determined smile. "I promise, Mom. This is going to work, I know it." With that, they set to work, compiling their evidence and drafting a formal complaint to the HOA board. As they made their way to the community center for the next meeting, Max couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. For once, he had the upper hand, and he was determined to use it to finally put an end to Karen's reign of terror. The community center was abuzz with activity as the residents of the neighborhood gathered for the monthly HOA meeting. Max and Sarah sat in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together as they waited for the proceedings to begin. When the meeting was called to order, Max took a deep breath and rose to his feet, clutching a thick folder of evidence. "Excuse me, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "My mother and I have a formal complaint to bring before the board." The chairman, a stern-faced man in his 50s, regarded Max with a raised eyebrow. "Very well, young man. What seems to be the issue?" Max launched into a detailed recounting of the past few weeks, outlining Karen's pattern of harassment, property damage, and physical assault. As he spoke, he could feel the room's attention shifting, the air thick with tension. When he finished, the chairman turned to Karen, who was sitting stiffly in the back of the room, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Mrs. Wilkins, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Karen rose to her feet, her eyes narrowed to slits. This is all lies and nonsense. She spat, her voice shrill. That boy is a menace, and his mother is just as bad for enabling him. I've done nothing wrong. I'm simply trying to uphold the standards of this community. The chairman held up a hand, silencing her. Be that as it may, Mrs. Wilkins, the evidence presented here is quite compelling. It appears you have violated several of the HOA's bylaws, including destruction of property and physical assault. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red, and for a moment, Max thought she might launch herself at him. But the chairman continued, his voice grave. The board has no choice but to issue you a formal warning. Any further infractions will result in hefty fines and potentially expulsion from the HOA. As the room erupted into a murmur of hushed conversation, Max felt a surge of triumph. They had won, for now, at least. But as he watched Karen slink out of the room, her eyes burning with undisguised hatred, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next few weeks were tense, to say the least. While Karen had been forced to keep her distance due to the HOA's warning, Max could feel her seething presence like a dark cloud hanging over their home. Whenever he stepped outside, he would scan the neighborhood, half expecting to see her lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. One afternoon, as Max was tossing a ball around in the backyard, he heard the distinct crunch of gravel and the slamming of a car door. Whirling around, he felt his heart skip a beat as he caught sight of Karen striding towards him, her face contorted with rage. "You little brat!" she screamed, her voice shrill and trembling. "How dare you try to ruin me?" Max froze, the ball slipping from his grasp as he stared at the enraged woman. I didn't do anything wrong," he stammered, his voice quivering. "The hell you didn't." Karen lunged forward, her hands outstretched as if to throttle him. "You and your mother are going to pay for this, mark my words." Suddenly, a firm hand gripped Karen's arm, yanking her back. Max's eyes widened as he recognized the figure. It was his mother, her face set in a mask of fierce determination. "That's enough, Karen," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous. "If you take one more step towards my son, I won't be responsible for what happens next." Karen's eyes narrowed as she glared at Sarah, her chest heaving with fury. "You think you can threaten me, you?" But before she could finish her sentence, a deep, rumbling voice cut her off. "I think you'd better listen to the lady, ma'am." Max and Sarah both turned to see a towering figure emerging from the shadows, a man with broad shoulders and a commanding presence. It was Sarah's father, a retired professional boxer, and he was glaring at Karen with undisguised contempt. Karen's face drained of color as she realized the full gravity of the situation. Glancing back and forth between the three of them, she let out a frustrated growl and stormed back to her car, muttering curses under her breath. As the sound of her tires crunching on the gravel faded into the distance, Max turned to his mother and grandfather, his eyes shining with relief and gratitude. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what we'd do without you." His grandfather smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "Anytime, kid. Now, how about we go a few rounds and teach that old hag a lesson she won't soon forget?" In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Karen had been unusually quiet, and Max couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settling over him. One day, as he was walking home from school, he noticed a small envelope tucked into the mailbox. Curious, he pulled it out and felt his stomach drop as he recognized the familiar handwriting. "Mom," he called out as he burst through the front door, his voice tinged with worry. "We have a problem." Sarah emerged from the kitchen, her brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, honey?" Max wordlessly handed her the envelope, watching as her expression darkened with each passing second. "This can't be good," she murmured, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the page, and Max could see the color draining from her face. "What does it say?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's a cease and desist order from Karen's lawyer. She's threatening to sue us for defamation and harassment if we don't stop interfering with her HOA duties." Max felt a wave of dread wash over him. "But we have all the evidence. How can she do this?" "She's playing dirty, Max," Sarah replied, her voice weary. "She knows the legal battle will be long and expensive, and we don't have the resources to fight it. She's trying to scare us into backing down." Max clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "So, what are we going to do? We can't just let her win." Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and determination. "We're going to have to be smart about this, Max. We can't let her intimidate us, but we also can't afford to get dragged into a costly legal battle. We'll have to find another way to handle this." As the two of them sat in tense silence, a glimmer of an idea began to take shape in Max's mind. It was risky, but if it worked, it might just be the key to finally putting an end to Karen's reign of terror. The next day, Max approached his mother with a plan. "Mom, I think I know how we can get Karen to back off for good," he said, his eyes alight with determination. Sarah eyed him warily. "I'm listening, but whatever it is, it can't involve anything illegal or dangerous." Max shook his head. "Don't worry, it's nothing like that. It's just, well, you know how Grandpa used to be a boxer, right?" Sarah's brow furrowed. "Yes, but what does that have to do with—" "What if we challenged Karen to a boxing match?" Max blurted out, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Grandpa could train us, and we could settle this once and for all in the ring. No more lawyers, no more threats. Just us, Karen, and the rules of the sport." Sarah stared at her son, her expression a mix of disbelief and amusement. "You can't be serious, Max. That's the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard." But as she studied his face, she could see the unwavering resolve in his eyes. Letting out a resigned sigh, she ran a hand through her hair. "All right, fine. I'll talk to your grandfather, but I can't promise he'll go along with this." To her surprise, when she approached her father with the plan, he let out a booming laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. Sounds like a plan to me." He clapped his hands together, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We'll have that old battle axe begging for mercy by the time I'm done with her." And so the stage was set. Word quickly spread through the neighborhood about the impending boxing match, and it wasn't long before Karen, seething with rage, agreed to the challenge. On the day of the fight, the community center was packed to the rafters, the air thick with tension. As the two combatants stepped into the ring, Max could feel his heart pounding in his chest. But with his mother and grandfather by his side, he knew they were ready to put an end to Karen's reign of terror, once and for all. The opening bell rang, and the battle began.